Step one of the forward lunge is picking a target for your front leg to step to. So that target should be consistent for both legs. And when it comes to how far you're physically stepping, that's gonna vary from athlete to athlete. But generally, look for an angle of the 90-degree angle of the back and front leg. I personally like to have that knee track a little bit more over the toe. Two things to keep in mind is that one, you shouldn't be so long to where the hip is just in a very uncomfortable position, because it's just gonna throw you off when you're doing consistent multiple reps. And if you're too shallow, if that heel's coming off on that front foot, then you may wanna elongate that step. Again, it's gonna vary a little bit, but generally starting with a 90-90 angle is a good place to start for the forward lunge. All right, step two, now that we've picked our target, we are then gonna step, thinking about 3 performance tips. Number one is we don't wanna slam the knee into the ground. We can lightly touch it or we can hover it. Go with whatever you prefer and make it consistent. If you like to touch and that's that like mental cue that, okay, that's a full rep, time to stand back up, do it, or you can lightly hover it, it doesn't matter. The second performance tip we're gonna think about is our foot position and how we track our knee. We do not want that foot coming in. That's gonna put our knee into a weird position where it's either gonna track forward or go valgus. We wanna have that toe either forward or a little bit angled out. Go for obviously what's a little bit more preferable and comfortable for you. And we want that knee to track forward. So if we take our lunge a little bit more shallow, that knee is gonna track forward similar to how it would in a squat. We're not wavering it in and we're not having that go varus and go way outside. So the final performance tip to think about in this step is torso positioning. So our torso is gonna stay stacked over the pelvis, similar to how it would be in a squat. We don't wanna be leaning back, especially if you have weight on our back or we're holding weight. So our torso is over our pelvis, so we're accurately displacing that weight over the center of our gravity. All right, step three, we're gonna step. We have controlled our eccentric, we've thought about the performance tips. We're then gonna grip the floor with our foot and drive through that quad back to the starting position. Thing to think about when performing walking lunges is your breathing pattern. You're not gonna be as strict like with the Valsalva maneuver as you are with like, let's say a big 3 movement, so like a maximal deadlift, but you do wanna have some rhythmic pattern to your breathing. So just as a quick example, let's say you have a barbell in the front rack position and you exhale on the way down. If that puts your torso into a poor position and throws your center of gravity out of whack, then obviously that's a sign to hold your breath a little bit longer. Breathing patterns and movements like the lunge that are a little bit more dynamic will vary slightly, so keep that in mind when working through these 3 steps. So note that that was only the forward lunge. There are a lot of different lunge variations, and note these are not split squats. If you're confused as to what's the difference between a lunge and a split squat, we've actually filmed that video before. I'm gonna link that up in that top corner, but long story short, a lunge is different because we're moving the feet and they're not physically static the whole time. So for example, we have the walking lunge where you're gonna be stepping every step. We have the backward lunge where you step backwards, the lateral lunge where you step out to the side, and there are other smaller variations like the curtsy lunge and so forth. But for the sake of this video, we're gonna keep it to the main 4, AKA forward, walking, lateral, and backwards. All right, so what are the muscles worked by the lunge? Well, the lunge is a co-contractor of the quads, hamstrings, and glutes. So that means basically that every time you're performing a lunge, there's gonna be some level of activation within the quads, hamstrings, and glutes, and it really comes down to the variation you're performing. They're all gonna be active across the board to some degree for every lunge variation, but they will be different depending on the slight variations we use. And that's why I think the lunge is so great. So besides the angle in which you can lunge, there are a ton of different ways to load the lunge. So you can hold dumbbells, kettlebells, you can hold one dumbbell or a kettlebell on each side, and you can switch that depending on what kind of variation you want to use. You can use a barbell on the back, you can hold a barbell in the front, you can hold a sandbag, you can do even a goblet squat hold. There are endless possibilities with the lunge, and that's why it is so interesting and why when you program them, there should be a level of thought when using them. What's the adaptation you're going for? What are you trying to actually target? If you're trying to actually create a deeper stretch, adding an elevation on where you're stepping, or adding an elevation from where you're stepping from is something to consider. So when thinking about the lunge and when thinking about the muscles it works, don't limit yourself to just the angle. Think about how you're loading them too. All right, to wrap up this video, let's quickly go over the benefits and some common mistakes that come along with the lunge. So, some benefits. Obviously, it's a great movement to include variation with, and those variations will then target different muscles to a varied degree. It's also a great movement to perform pretty much anywhere. You don't need a lot to start lunging, and you could change your angle, etc. to make the intensity slightly harder. And the last benefit that I like to personally use is that the lunge is great for highlighting different limitations. For example, my lateral lunge is absolute trash. My abductors are incredibly tight, and the lunge helps me kind of see where my limitations lie and what I really need to focus on when it comes to being able to move through different planes of movement and do so with ease without having to falter mechanics to hit depth and complete great reps. Now, a couple mistakes worth noting really quickly on the lunge is obviously loading too heavily too quickly. If you are reckless and abandoned with this movement and you are banging your knee on the ground or losing your torso and pelvis positioning, then be mindful and lighten the load, and honestly take the movement a little bit slower. There's no need to go all out on this movement until you really nail the mechanics. Mistake number 2 is not squaring the hips at the initiation of each movement. So if you're stepping forward or backwards, not opening up that hip to a large degree. Opening it up will create a slight bias in the movement and take away some of the work you're trying to put on the main prime moving muscles. The third mistake is using lunges without intent. I feel like I made a pretty good point in this video that lunges and their variations should all have intent behind them, so know why you're using them. Don't just program a lunge and just load it with some random weight to do it. Understand why you're doing it and what it's gonna help progress, as that's gonna make you a better athlete and coach. And that wraps up our forward lunge guide. If you want more on this topic and you wanna read more about the variations and what they help target, check out the article below. I have a full written guide down there, or you can Google BarBend and forward lunge.